Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. My name is Nora Kyle Messier, and I am the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I am here to introduce our newest episode of Hidden Collections. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you're a regular viewer, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. It is our custom here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum to begin all programs, whether we are together in person or gathering online, by taking a moment to acknowledge and pay due respect to the Wampanoag people on whose ancestral land, here known as Nabnocket on Noepe, the museum stands. We recognize their millennia of stewardship, their continued presence in and contributions to our island and our community. Today's episode includes a very special look at the behind-the-scenes aspect of our newest exhibit, The Chasm Is Not Closed, on view now in the Wagaman Community Gallery. This exhibit is unique in that it not only tells the story of an island-wide controversy that is both new and old, but it shares with you the process of interpreting an artifact, especially ones like the plaques from the Civil War Soldiers Memorial in Oak Bluffs. The exhibit is open through April 29th, so come take a look if you're in the neighborhood and you haven't already. I'll turn you over to our ever-popular host and inimitable research librarian, Bo Van Riper, in just a moment after a few standard preliminaries. Please feel free to pop any questions that you might have into the chat box or into the Q&A, and we'll save time at the end to answer them. And I'm sure Zoom already told you, but just as a reminder, we are recording these sessions for future reference. Thanks again for being here. Bo, take it away.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, as always, to Savannah behind the scenes for making me look far more competent sharing my screen on Zoom than I actually am. And welcome on this gray February day to another episode of Hidden Collections, a look at some of the lesser known, less seen elements in the photographic and documentary archives of the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I'd like to start today with something I've never done before in Hidden Collections, and that is to acknowledge the passing of one of the authors whose books are on the shelves of the library here behind me. Robert C. Hayden, who died a few days ago at the age of 84, was a historian, an educator, an activist, a chronicler of African-American life in America, in Massachusetts, and especially on Martha's Vineyard. He was the author in the late 90s of African Americans on Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, and then in 2005 of a revised edition that was whose focus was narrowed to Martha's Vineyard alone, and which was revised and updated with some old material he felt was not up to the standards of the book deleted and new material added. There are some authors, like the late Art Railton and Gail Huntington, my predecessors as editor of the Museum Journal, who had long careers writing about the history of Martha's Vineyard. There are others who, although they only wrote one book on the history of Martha's Vineyard, made in that book an overwhelmingly significant contribution to our understanding of the island and its past. Robert Hayden was in the latter category, and no one trying to understand the history of African Americans on Martha's Vineyard can really, truly know what there is at this moment to know about the subject without paying due attention to Hayden's book. It is not an academic history, but rather a compilation of information about, as its subtitle suggests, people, places, and events. Not just the well-known figures like Charles and Henrietta Shearer of Shearer Cottage fame, or Captain William Martin, the black whaling master from Edgartown, but dozens and dozens of others, both familiar and less familiar, both modern and extending back as far as the 18th century. The beginnings of studying the history of any subject is to gather together what's already known and understand where the gaps, where the holes, where the thin spots are, where we don't know as much as we wish we did. Hayden, more than any other author, living or dead, did that for the history of African Americans on Martha's Vineyard. And his books will remain essential to us here at the museum and to all vineyard historians for many decades to come. Robert C. Hayden will be missed here in the halls of the Martha's Vineyard Museum and throughout the Commonwealth. Meanwhile, next slide, the work of the museum rolls on, including preparing for our upcoming exhibit this summer to celebrate the centennial of New York-born vineyard wash-ashore artist Stanley Murphy. This is not Stanley Murphy. That's George A. Huff, the editor of the New Bedford Standard, the father of Vineyard Gazette editor Henry Beadle Huff, who featured in our Gazette exhibit a few months back. This is also not a painting by Murphy. This, you may recognize the style, is a painting of Huff by Thomas Hart Benton, another vineyard wash-ashore, who did it in 1946 and titled it New England Editor. Next slide, please. This is Stanley Murphy's take 2 years later on George Huff, again seated in his house, summer house in North Tisbury. This was donated to the museum in 2008, along with an enormous collection of Murphy's drawings, cartoons, paintings, sketches, studies, and whatnot, along with several boxes of Murphy's personal papers. All of that, including possibly this portrait of George Huff, will become grist for the mill that is producing the Stanley Murphy exhibit that will open in the Hollenshed Gallery and adjacent galleries this summer come June. If you enjoy vineyard art, if you enjoy seeing the vineyard through the eyes of a talented artist who lived here for many, many decades and loved its people and its landscape, mark your calendar to come see the Stanley Murphy exhibit this summer. It will be quite a show. Meanwhile, next slide. We are slowly working through a backlog of recently and not so recently received material and being reminded as we do that there is always something that you didn't realize you knew about the history of the vineyard. For example, that the Martha's Vineyard Summer Institute, a summer school for teachers that was held in Cottage City, later Oak Bluffs, in the late 19th and very early 20th century, had, at least for a time in the 1880s, its own newspaper. The Summer Institute Herald, which was a 4-page biweekly aimed at those off-island teachers who were attending the Summer Institute in order to beef up their content knowledge or learn better pedagogical skills. This particular issue of the Summer Institute Herald contained extensive advertisements for school books, for pens, for pencils, all sorts of things that might be of interest to the visiting teachers. It was printed in Cottage City, probably on the same press that had for 3 years printed the Cottage City Star, and that would, in 3 more years, 1885, be handed over to a fellow from the South named Strong, who would retitle it the Martha's Vineyard Herald and go on in the fullness of time to use it to lobby for and raise funds for the creation of a statue honoring the local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Next slide, please. The Summer Institute Herald was located, or its editorial offices were located on Commercial Avenue in the highlands of Oak Bluffs, just inland from where the East Chop Beach Club is now, in a building called Agassi Hall, which was the principal classroom building of the Summer Institute. Agassi Hall was named after Jean-Louis Rodolphe Agassi, who was a professor of comparative zoology at Harvard, and who, for a brief time in the year before he died, had started a summer research institute on Penaquis Island, the far end of the Elizabeth chain, so that students from Harvard bent on a scientific career could learn how to do biological research in the field. Next slide, please. The issue of the Summer Institute Herald that recently came into our possession included this particular item, a letter from a person who signed themselves only W, objecting to the fact that the name of the hall in which the paper had its editorial offices and in which the Institute had its classes was being mispronounced. It is not, the learned W declared. Agassi, with the accent on the first syllable, it is in Switzerland, Agassi with no accent. Let the record show that while it may have been Agassi in Switzerland, it was in 1882 and remained thereafter Agassi in the United States. Louis Agassi was one of the towering figures in the history of 19th century American science and remains a significant figure in 19th century American history. I have, over the course of my historical career, run into a lot of people writing and talking about Louis Agassi, and every single one of them, even the ones who weren't from the Vineyard, pronounced it with the accent on the first syllable. Sorry, W. Next slide. Every so often, you just run across something that makes you stop and go, wow. Dr. Winchell, whose 8th and 9th lectures on the general subject of science and religion were given in August of 1882 at Union Chapel in Oak Bluffs, is another one of those towering figures of 19th century American science. But unlike Agassi, whose name is still inscribed on buildings at Harvard and Stanford and elsewhere, Winchell has essentially been forgotten. He was trained as a geologist in, if memory serves, Minnesota, and he spent his entire career in the mid to late 19th century fighting a long rearguard action against the idea that Genesis had nothing to say about geology, and that science and religion did not, at the level of detail that modern day creationists, or for that matter, 19th century creationists, believed to be the case, inform each other about the specifics of Earth history. Winchell, Alexander Winchell, was deeply committed to the idea that you could, in the books of Moses in the Bible, read a parallel text that would illuminate the book of nature, as poetic 19th century scientists called it, written in the rocks of the Vineyard and elsewhere on Earth. His solution to the, quote, supposed conflict of science and religion, the subject of his 9th lecture, was not that, as Galileo said to the Inquisition in the 17th century, the Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Winchell's concept was that there was no actual conflict between science and religion because, in point of fact, the words of Genesis about the creation and early history of the earth entirely lined up and made entire harmonious sense with the latest findings of science. Dr. Winchell, like Agassi and many of his views, wound up being on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of the advance of science. But just knowing that he came to Martha's Vineyard, to Cottage City in 1882, and lectured to what was doubtless a large and interested audience in Union Chapel, says something about how far, how fast Cottage City had come as a destination by then. The island and what had been a farmer's sheep field in the far outskirts of Edgartown had, at least for the summer months, become a cosmopolitan happening place where nationally famous people like Winchell came to give not just a speech, but a 9-speech course of lectures. Next slide. You all recognize this, of course. I'm sure many of you have used a calligraph yourself. For ministers, lawyers, bankers, and all writers, always ready and reliable, can be used at once, practice giving great speed. Its work is legible and beautiful. It's easy to forget in this day and age where the typewriter has gone the way of the buggy whip and the antimacassar, that once upon a time in the 1870s and 80s, the typewriter was the highest of high technology. And even the name of the thing had not yet settled into general use. You could, if you went to MC Beals in Boston in the summer of '82, have bought yourself a piece of state-of-the-art communication technology. And the recipients of your letters and your reports would never have to worry again about whether your handwriting was actually legible. A glimpse into the future of the history of technology from the age of Chester A. Arthur. Next slide, please. This is a beautiful example of why you might want to worry about whether your recipients, the recipients of your documents, could actually read your handwriting. This is a receipt for freight consignment out of New Bedford on the steamer Martha's Vineyard bound for the island sometime in July 1881. It is, in one sense, no more historically significant than the wads of receipts you pull out of your pants pocket or your coat pocket at the end of the day and throw in a box or throw in the trash. It's just one of those pieces of detritus generated by any large commercial society. And yet, viewed from 140 years on through the eyes of a historian, it tells us a variety of interesting things. This is one of a set of such receipts, all made out to Look, Washburn and Company by the freight agent in New Bedford, all for packages of beef and bags of unspecified groceries. Because Look and Washburn ran one of the many grocery stores on the island. And what these slips suggest is that Mr. Look and Mr. Washburn were importing beef and other materials that they sold in their stores from suppliers off island. It was shipped to New Bedford likely by train, then loaded onto wagons and hauled to the wharf where it was loaded into the holds of, in this case, the Martha's Vineyard, or according to other receipts, the island home or the River Queen, big side wheel steamers of the 19th century. And then offloaded again at the freight shed at homes at Vineyard Haven or Oak Bluffs or Edgartown to be claimed by some representative of Look and Washburn. Part of what the advent of steam ferries in the 1850s did was to make the conduit bringing mainland goods like the beef that Mr. Look and Mr. Washburn were shipping here smoother and easier. Part of what the advent of sidewheel steam ferries in the 1850s and on down through the 19th century did was to make it easier to bring a wider variety of goods at lower cost to the island. If the island was ever self-sufficient, and that's an argument for another day, it had long since ceased to be so by the summer of 1881. And Mr. Look and Mr. Washburn's freight receipts from the steamers demonstrate that in a quiet, low-key kind of way. By the way, notice the cost. One package of beef, 7 bags of something or other, 43 cents plus 9 cents handling. Next slide, please. Of course, you all recognize this as a Stinson type U tri-motor airliner from the late 1920s, because really, who wouldn't? I jest, of course. Tri-motor airliners were all the rage in the 1920s. Ford, Fokker, Junkers all built them. So did Stinson, which was better known in the 1930s for a series of beautifully sleek single-engine private planes. But this particular Stinson tri-motor, which probably had a passenger capacity like its Ford counterpart of about 12 people, seated in wicker seats, one row on each side of the center aisle, is special. It belonged to Mayflower Airlines, and it was named the Oak Bluffs Clipper. And in the summer of 1929, it provided air service from East Boston, a field not yet named after General Logan or not yet known as Logan International, to Provincetown, Hyannis, Nantucket, and the Vineyard. Mayflower Airlines soldiered on from the 1920s on to the 1940s, when its flights to the islands were curtailed by World War II, and sold out to Northeast Airlines in 1944. It would have landed in 1929, not at the municipal airport in the center of the island. That wouldn't be built for the Navy's use until 1942, but likely at the Katama Airfield down south of Edgartown, where nowadays only private planes land. The name Oak Bluffs Clipper was perhaps a nod to the old clipper ships of the 19th century that went from New York to San Francisco in 100 days, or carried tea and other goods back from East Asia. More likely, it was a nod to Pan American Airways, which was then pioneering international service to Central and South America, with a series of multi-engine flying boats that were, by company policy, collectively known as Clippers. Mayflower Airlines was the beginnings of scheduled airline service to the Vineyard. Before the war, before the DC-3, before Provincetown, Boston, and long, long before the jets that made it necessary to fix the substandard bump. Next slide, please. This horribly developed portrait of a generic-looking 19th century guy is what's called a tintype, a photograph printed on a thin, chemically treated sheet of metal. Not unlike a daguerreotype, with the happy exception that if you dropped it, it wouldn't break. Dan Waters, perpetual friend of the and former employee of the museum, passed this on to us, having spotted and nabbed it on eBay. And the reason why it caught his attention is that name penciled on the bottom. The bearded, mustachioed gentleman in the picture is Silas Daggett. And if it's the Silas Daggett that we think it is, then this was the guy, the merchant ship captain, who looked at the bluffs at East Chop and said, by golly, there needs to be a lighthouse there. And when the government said, yeah, maybe someday, I don't know, we got one on West Chop, what's the big deal? Silas Daggett went out and raised money from his fellow ship owners and built one. And then when it burnt down, he built another one. And after that one had been in operation for a few years, the government looked up and decided that, well, maybe the man had a point. And so they bought Silas Daggett's lighthouse, moved it up the bluff a bit, still there, private house, funny looking square turret where the light used to be, and built the East Chop Lighthouse that we all know and love, now managed in the summer by the Martha's Vineyard Museum, hopefully open again soon after the lead paint contaminated soil has been cleaned up. And now, for the first time, we know maybe what the man who initiated the lighthouse on East Chop looked like. Next slide. Cleveland's baking powder, the wonder of the age, makes the finest cake and biscuit I ever saw, says the old lady in the frilly bonnet. They didn't have stuff like this when I was young. This is a pretty standard 19th century advertising card. And if I was more into culinary history than I am, I could give you a great explanation of why baking powder was a revolutionary thing to 19th century cooks. I'm sure Nora's smiling even as I say that, because she, I'm sure, does know why it was so revolutionary to 19th century cooks. But if you flip over this advertising card, next slide, please, you are treated to a long multi-paragraph disquisition on the virtues of cooking a husband. And yes, they mean it metaphorically. The Cleveland Baking Powder Company was not shilling for cannibalism, not even within the family. But its long explanation is a fascinating piece of both humor and social commentary, because the whole theme is a woman has to treat her husband as if it was raw material, as if he was raw material procured from the grocer, Hook and Washburn maybe, that had to be properly processed and cooked and prepared before he was suitably pliant and fit to live with. I'm not, in that brief description, doing it justice, but keep an eye out for this baking powder advertising card in a future issue of the Martha's Vineyard Museum Quarterly, because the entire text of the back is well worth your time to read and well worth a deeper dive into what it tells us about 19th century gender roles and how, just perhaps, they're a bit more complicated than we give them credit for. Next slide. And then there were advertising cards like that of W.D. Harding, the cashewist of Main Street, Vineyard Haven, that are a bit more to the point. Bargains, bargains, Mr. Harding promises. Hosiery, boots, shoes, underwear, collars, back in the days when collars were made out of celluloid and detachable from the neck of your shirt. Cuffs, etc., will be sold way, way down for cash. You know, you can almost imagine him on late night TV shilling for his local company in a poorly lit ad featuring members of his family as extras. This kind of advertising card was commonplace among local businesses, handed out on the street corners, left on the counter for you to bring home and pass on to your friends. And it reminds us, when one of them turns up, that when it comes to advertising, especially when it comes to advertising discount goods and bargains, bargains, there is nothing new under the sun. Indeed, W.D. Harding Shoe Store is now, at the moment, the Green Room Shoe Store. More things change on Main Street in Vineyard Haven, the more they stay the same. Next slide. Just a business card cleverly designed to look like a clam, you say, as I'm sure you say that kind of thing to yourself all the time. But if you open this particular advertising card, next slide, please, you find the following exhortation. Don't be a clam. I have no idea what that means, but go to John Bent, dealers in meat, groceries, provisions, fruits, etc., all the way down to fancy crackers in Edgartown, Massachusetts. And for your troubles, you get not only the sight of a beautifully artistically rendered view of the inside of a clam, you get a beautifully rendered shot of a scantily clad but not unattractive woman staring winsomely at you from the clamshell. Eat your heart out, Don Draper and all you 60s Madison Avenue types. It's the use of attractive women in completely irrelevant settings to sell things goes back a lot longer than we might be inclined to think. Next slide, please. This, well, perhaps you recognize the woman in the middle as Catherine Cornell, the leading lady of the American stage for much of the mid-20th century, and in retirement, a resident of the Chappaqua area of Tisbury up around Lake Tashmu, where she built a house she called Chip Chop. This is one of a series of photographs from the New York stage in the middle of the 20th century, this particular one taken by Van Damme, an extremely famous New York photographer of the era, that came to us in the collection of Elizabeth Busy Suppas, who was for many years Catherine Cornell's personal assistant and general friend and confidant and arranger of things on the Vineyard. Busy Suppas's estate gave us a huge quantity of material, which included much of what we have documenting the life and career of Catherine Cornell on the Vineyard and off. This particular photograph, along with two others, had gotten separated from the original donation. Now, happily, it can be reunited with it. And some future Catherine Cornell exhibit, not yet even imagined, will be better for it. Next slide. It's a long way from the New York stage to a park in Oak Bluffs, but that's where I want to turn now as we consider, as Nora said at the top of the hour, some of the background to the current exhibit open downstairs in the Wagaman Community Gallery titled "The Chasm Is Not Closed." The title of the exhibit is a play on the words that lead off this plaque. "The chasm is closed," the plaque said, and goes on to dedicate the tablet and rededicate the statue to whose base it's attached to, quote, "the Confederate soldiers." The dedication is offered in the spirit of the people of Oak Bluffs, and it was attached to the base of the Oak Bluffs Soldiers Memorial, the statue atop a plinth with fountains at the base that originally stood in front of where the Strand Theater is now and was moved in the 1930s to the lawn just opposite the Steamship Authority dock. The plaque was attached to the statue in 1925 at the behest of a group of Vineyard citizens led by one Sidna Eldridge of Vineyard Haven. For that side of the pedestal had, when the statue was dedicated in the 1890s, been left blank because Charles Strawn, the owner of the Martha's Vineyard Herald, who'd raised the money for the statue as a monument in honor of the Oak Bluffs chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization, had been, during the Civil War, a member of the Confederate Army. Now, after the war, moved north to where his wife had family, settled on the Vineyard, a newspaper editor and publisher. He made the gesture of raising a monument to the local Union veterans in the hope of being accepted by them socially, having been initially shunned by them as their former enemy. 3 of the 4 sides of the pedestal had plaques designed by Strawn that noted that he, a former Confederate soldier, had erected it in honor of the Grand Army, local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, and reprinting the initials that stood for the motto of the Grand Army. He left deliberately the 4th side of the statue covered with just a blank plaque, and at the dedication in the early 1890s expressed the hope that perhaps someday the Union veterans of the island would see fit to offer a gesture of reconciliation to him as he had offered one to them. As the exhibit makes clear, The sentiment that in 1925 seemed to those expressing it on the plaque unproblematic seemed by the early 21st century, in the light of Charlottesville and other developments, anything but unproblematic. In 2019, the local chapter of the NAACP requested that the town of Oak Bluffs remove the fourth plaque from the statue, along with a second plaque at the statue's base, added when the statue was refurbished and rededicated in 2011, that explained the history of the statue and the fourth plaque. Eventually, the Oak Bluffs Select Board voted to, in fact, remove the plaque and the 2011 edition at the base and transfer them to the Martha's Vineyard Museum. We have ever since been digging ever deeper into the history of the statue, of Charles Strawn, of the plaque, and of the larger and exceedingly complicated, nuanced story of Civil War memorials on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, and the place of memorials to long ago wars in the larger American culture. The exhibit is not the final word on the statue, the plaque, Civil War memorials in general, or this Civil War memorial in particular. Rather, it's a look inside how museum professionals in general, us in particular, try to do what we do, make sense of the past and interpret the bits of it that are left behind and placed in our care. Next slide, please. Part of what we have to help us make sense of the statue and its history is images like this one that show the statue being dedicated in its original home at the foot of Circuit Avenue in August of 1891. But part of what we have, next slide, please, to make sense of it, is also a series of photographs and documents gathered by the people who in 2010 and 2011 spearheaded the restoration and rededication of the statue. This is a picture of the statue as it existed in the early 21st century. You note, if you look at the base just below the soldier's feet, that the pedestal is streaked with rust, that the paint is scarred. If you could see closer up, you'd notice that bits of the statue were missing, having been broken off previously. You'll also notice, even without leaning close to your computer screens, that the statue is painted in lifelike flesh tones with a black mustache and black hair, and inexplicably a gray uniform. Inexplicably, because the soldier is indisputably and undeniably kitted out in a Union Army uniform. Fair enough, since it was a statue of a Union soldier to honor veterans of the Union Army. In the 1980s, some helpful member of the Oak Bluffs Department of Public Works, assigned to repaint the statue, concluded that repainting it gray would call attention to its uniqueness, specifically that it was a statue given in honor of Union veterans by a former Confederate soldier. Unfortunately, painting it gray contributed to the ongoing, never quite thoroughly extinguished myth that it actually represents a Confederate soldier. Even the great Gale Huntington, who should have known better, wrote in his 1969 Introduction to Martha's Vineyard that the Oak Bluff Civil War Memorial is the only only such memorial north of the Mason-Dixon line that depicts a Confederate soldier. No, it isn't, and no, it doesn't. Next slide, please. This is the statue immediately before it was restored, having been still missing bits, still rusty, still badly in need of repair, but at least repainted to mimic a kind of bronze patina. Next slide, please. This is the statue's rededication in 2001. attended by, among other people, members of local veterans associations like the American Legion, the gentleman on the left there in the white shirt, and by Civil War reenactors, including two gentlemen on the left holding their rifles in front of them, representing the 54th Massachusetts, one of the famous all African-American, although white officered regiments that were raised to fight on the Union side. Next slide, please. Here's the statue after its rededication, reinstallation, restoration, the statue as it stands now. And here, next slide, please, is the statue, but not our statue. Next slide, please. That isn't our statue either. Among other things, it's sitting on a granite pedestal, not an iron one. The existence of those two statues, one in Illinois, the other in Kingston, Rhode Island, underscore one of the elements of the story of the Oak Bluff Soldiers Memorial that tends to get lost in the cracks. Specifically, that the statue that's part of the Oak Bluff Soldiers Memorial was not a one-off work of art commissioned and created for the purpose. It was cast in a foundry in an established mold and ordered off the rack out of a catalog of statuary. You want a statue of a Union Army soldier? Great, we've got one. It's this high, this wide, weighs this much, and costs this amount of money. Cash, check, or bank transfer, whatever you like. There are duplicates of, quote unquote, our Civil War statue all over the North. It was, as many Civil War statues were, if not mass-produced object, at least a manufactured as opposed to individually crafted object. And in that respect, it troubles in interesting ways our understanding of what we mean when we say public art. Is a monument topped by a mass-produced object art? Can it ever be art? Or does it become art by virtue of having been elevated, literally and figuratively, in a place of public visibility, just as if it were a one-of-a-kind commissioned for the purpose, carved or cast figure? Next slide, please. But who was the statue for? Yes, we always hand wave at the fact that it was erected on behalf of the Oak Bluffs chapter, Henry Clay Wade Post number 201 of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was, to reiterate, not the name of an actual U.S. military force, an actual division of the Union or the Union Army as a whole, but a post-war Union veterans organization akin to, say, the VFW or the American Legion. The Henry Clay Wade Post of the GAR had been founded in Oak Bluffs in 1890, just a year before, say, call it 18 months, tops. Strawn's statue was dedicated in front of where the Strand Theater stands now. We have a collection of the records of the GAR, Oak Bluffs Post. And here is their first minute book, the one that began in 1890 when the Post was first founded. These are the guys. Then, does math quickly in his head, a quarter century after the end of hostilities, men who'd been in their teens and early 20s when they put on the Union blue, now well into middle age, banding together with their fellow Union veterans, united by their shared experience of having gone to war on behalf of the Union as young men. Next slide, please. These are the names of the charter members: Henry Coy, who was the first president, B.T. Hillman, Tripp, Vincent, old Vineyard names, John N. Luce, William Mary, and on and on and on. Alonzo Ripley, Frank Norden, E.A. Athern, and David Beadle. B.T. Hillman, if that name sounds vaguely familiar, if you've ever seen a picture of the Edgartown courthouse, the brick courthouse on Main Street, seen a picture of a distinguished looking balding gentleman in a wooden swivel chair with a long white, my picture belongs on a box of cough drops, 19th century beard. That's Judge B.T. Hillman in his natural habitat on the second floor of the courthouse, where he served for many years as judge of the probate court. But before he was the judge of the probate court, before he was an unsuccessful candidate for representative to the Massachusetts state legislature in that famed 1879 election that put Stephen Flanders in the state house and paved the way for the independence of Oak Bluffs from Edgartown. Before he was any of that, B.T. Hillman had been a Chilmark school teacher. And before he was that, he was a young officer in the 45th Regiment, Massachusetts Volunteers, Company K. Like a lot of young men who served in the Civil War, like I'd be willing to bet, all of the men listed on that list of charter members, the Henry Clay Wade Post number 201, B.T. Hillman was shaped for the rest of his life by the experience of having gone away to war and fought on behalf of the Union. As a great many men of a later generation were shaped by the experience of going to France with the American Expeditionary Force, and a great many of the generation after that were shaped by the experience of going abroad to fight totalitarianism in the Second World War. Some of them came home, hung their uniforms in the closet, went on with their lives, and never looked back. Others, like Hillman, and I suspect the men who were listed on this list of charter members, never quite gave up the memories of what the war had meant for them. And the war became thus part of their identity, part of who they were, part of what formed them as people. Next slide, please. The GAR was one of the most formidable political lobbying organizations of the late 19th century. And both for social and fraternal reasons, and one suspects to flex and display their political muscle, they met each year in so-called grand encampments that brought GAR chapters from all over the country together in some large city for meetings and speeches and fellowship and whatnot. Here's the cover from the GAR Grand Encampment program held in the year that the Grand Encampment was held in Boston. It was, perhaps not coincidentally, 1890, the year before, rather the year that the Henry Clay Wade Post was founded in Oak Bluffs. The year before, Strawn put up the statue he'd campaigned to raise funds for. Who were those guys in the Henry Clay Wade Post, those guys whose favor Charles Strawn was courting with the statue? Next slide, please. They were these guys, old men. This is probably taken about 10 years after the statue was put up, 1900, 1905, in there on the steps of what was still just barely the Edgartown National Bank, who, when they went to their GAR meetings, dressed up in uniforms that rhymed with, though did not actually duplicate, the uniforms they'd worn as young men. Next slide, please. There were people like Beriah Hillman here in 1920 at the dedication of the World War I Memorial in at the corner of Main Street and Peases Point Way in Edgartown, surrounded by grinning young men from the American Expeditionary Force, back from France and being celebrated in their turn by the people of Edgartown. Next slide, please. There were people like Harry Costello, who owned a house which became an inn at the corner of Church Street and Main Street at Vineyard Haven, the Tashmoo Inn, back before it moved up the street to where the Montessori School is now. Harry Costello was, when the fourth plaque was put on the Civil War Memorial, one of the last surviving Civil War veterans on the Vineyard. He was still alive in the early 1930s. My father, then a small boy, remembers seeing him go by in an open car in the Memorial Day parades and being told by his mother, "Look at that, Tony. You'll never see that again. That man fought in the Civil War." It was in the midst of that kind of sentiment, that sentiment that the World War II generation excited in the last decade or so as they passed into history, that the fourth 1925 plaque was added to the statue. These men are old and dying. They won't come again. Let's, the sentiment went in 1925, close the circle and tell Charles Strawn that, yes, we accept him as a comrade in arms at last. Except, as the exhibit suggests, as we're still trying to come to grips with, it's never just that simple. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the move to put up the 1925 plaque was motivated in part by a woman named Sidney Eldridge. That's her on the right, with her husband, George W. Eldridge. They lived in Vineyard Haven on a house on William Street, and later in a house on Grove Avenue. And George W. Eldridge was, like his father before him, a chart maker and publisher. If you or someone you know has ever bought a copy of Eldridge's Tide and Pilot book that lists the tides and maps the currents for harbors all the way from Boston to Baltimore and beyond, you've held part of George W. Eldridge's legacy in your hands. His legacy also included promoting the island as a tourist destination. He was one of the people who first coined in the 1880s the concept of Martha's Vineyard, the Isle of Health, where fresh ocean breezes and wholesome food would allow you to rejuvenate after a season spent in the heat and the dust and the smoke and the noise and the crowds of the city. He also, in 1913, published one of the island's iconic tourist maps. You've probably seen the reproductions hanging in the windows or shops like off Main and Vineyard Haven. It's green and has cartoons or ships and whatnot surrounding a picture of the island. Sidney Eldridge, meanwhile, was one of that generation of Gilded Age and Progressive Era women who denied the vote, both locally and nationally, channeled their activities into clubs and into lobbying behind the scenes for social reform. Sidney Eldridge and her sisters gave Vineyard Haven its library and its high school. She had 4 daughters, and she thought the idea that Vineyard Haven didn't have a high school where her daughters, and oh yes, the boys as well, could attend was an absolute disgrace. Oak Bluffs had one after all, and so did Edgartown. Why not Vineyard Haven too? And so it came to pass. The Sidney Eldridges of the world were the mainstays of the Homemakers Club and the Want to Know Club, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and in time, when the 19th Amendment came to pass, of the League of Women Voters. Next slide, please. George and Sidney had 4 daughters, Nina, Mary, Ruth, and Gracia, left to right there. Gracia Harrington, by the time it happened, was invited to raise the flag over the Martha's Vineyard Regional High School when it opened in 1959, commemorating the role that her mother had played in bringing the first Tisbury High School into existence. Ruth, the second from the right, went on to marry an Australian instrument maker named Wilfred White. Riv, as he was known, and Ruth took over publication of her father's tide book and charts. And to this day, Eldridge's Tide and Pilot book remains in the hands of the White family. Ruth herself was more of an artistic type. She ran a rather bohemian-feeling summer camp on the shores of Lake Tashmoo, and one of the counselors was her daughter, named Sidna after her grandmother, who went on to become a leading artist, musician, patron of the arts in Vineyard Haven, and one of the founders of the Tisbury Museum, which in the late 80s merged both collections and personnel with the Martha's Vineyard Museum. The captain's daughters of Martha's Vineyard, the four girls pictured here, became the subject of a book by Elliot Eldridge Macy, their cousin, in which they recalled stories of their childhood years in the late 19th century on the vineyard. Gracia Harrington was in old age interviewed in one of the earlier interviews in the Martha's Vineyard Museum oral history collection. And bits and pieces of the Eldridge family's contributions to vineyard history filled the archives and the photo collections of the museum. I end on George and Sidna and their daughters, not because they're central to the story of the Civil War monument and the plaques and the exhibit downstairs in the community gallery, which, if you're in the neighborhood, as Nora said, I urge you to come visit. It will well repay the time you spend. It's not that they were central to that story. They were, at best, peripheral. But they, and the story of the Oak Bluff Civil War Memorial in general, are reminders that when it comes to the history of the vineyard or the history of any place, when it comes to any historical story, there are always more layers to unpeel. And there are always webs of connections that tie together seemingly disparate elements. The fact, for example, that Sidna Eldridge was not only the mastermind behind the campaign to put the fourth plaque on the statue, but that she was tied into the great Eldridge Tide and Pilot book enterprise, that her daughter was tied into the birth of the Martha's Vineyard of the Tisbury High School, and that as a member of the Want to Know Club, she went to meetings at the Tashmoo Inn on the corner of Main Street and Church Street, across the street from Mr. Harding's discount cash-only shoe store, owned by a graying Civil War veteran named Harry Costello. History is always more complicated than it appears at first glance. And here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, we try to never lose sight of that fact. Thank you for tuning in today. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Thank you, Bo. That was, as always, outstanding. In the questions and answers, we only have an indication that there may be another twin of our statue in Oak Bluffs in Hackettstown, New Jersey.
Ah, good to know. I will add it to the list, and thank you.
That was from Peter Boak. And Gail Stiller says this has been great and thank you. And I think all of us agree. And we thank you always for joining us here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum live online as we are today. Our next episode will be 1 month from today. It will be on Wednesday, March 2nd, again at 12:30. Look for the registration link on our calendar on our website, mvmuseum.org. And thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.